Welcome to Sherlock Mysteries, where mysteries come to life. Don't forget to like and share this video with other mystery aficionados. Let's get started. Chapter 1. A quiet arrival. St. Mary's was unusually quiet that autumn morning. The rising sun, Miss Jane Marple, seated by her parlour window, observed every detail with calm curiosity. She took in the wisp of chimney smoke drifting from the nearby cottages, the gentle clop of a milk cart, and Mrs. Florence Tabbycat skulking across the vicarage lawn despite the tranquility. Miss Marple detected a little discomfort stirring. In the crisp air, no sooner had she finished her breakfast of delicately buttered toast than a knock heard at the door. It was her dear friend. Mrs. Dolly Bantry's face was filled with both excitement and concern, and Jane whispered conspiratorially, "You'll never guess, there's been the strangest talk at the post office, something about peculiar comings and goings. At Maplewood Inn just outside the village." Miss Marple smiled politely, setting aside her knitting, and murmured, "Yes." Word had reached the village. Maplewood, an old coaching house that had been transformed into a modest hotel, was hosting an interesting collection of guests. Mrs. Rose, eager for a distraction from her otherwise boring day, recommended they spend afternoon tea. "They're just the two of us," she added, "to see what we can see." Miss Marple agreed, since she had always found a certain thrill in observing human nature, especially when things didn't seem quite right. By 2 o'clock, the duo found themselves on Maplewood's ivy-clad doorway. Inside the inn's parlour oozed a gentile charm, fading floral wallpaper, a scattering of briquet armchairs, and the faint aroma of lavender polish. Nothing seemed to miss at first glance. A nice maid led them to a table near the window, where they ordered tea and a slice of sponge cake. Miss Marple allowed her eyes to W, noting details with practiced care. Sitting by the hearth was Colonel Moody, a man whose stern bearing and neatly trimmed moustache spoke of his military past. He appeared to be reading, but Miss Marple noticed he rarely turned a page. Near the piano sat a gentleman in an immaculate suit, silver head and slightly stooped. Mrs. Rose identified him as Mr. Roll. A third figure quickly drew her eye. Miss Charlotte White, an unassuming librarian from a nearby town, quiet, almost timid, she kept mostly to herself, but Miss Marple saw her jump every time the parlour door opened. Nervous or shy, it was difficult to say. Meanwhile, bustling about was Mrs. Beryl Haywood, the improprietor, a woman of fixed smiles and a barely concealed anxiety in her eyes. As Miss Marple sipped her tea, a polite conversation sprang up between them and Mrs. Haywood, who confessed with forced cheer that Mrs. Haywood hesitated and fiddled with the edge of her apron. "He's had a terrible week," she said uncertainly before racing off to greet a new arrival. Miss Marple's soft glance scanned the room again, pausing on each face. Something lingered unspoken in the air, a shared tension or a delicate secret no one could disclose. She noticed subtle clues. Colonel Moody's continual watch over the doorway, Mr. Hamilton's drumming fingers, Miss White's anxious posture, and Mrs. Haywood's trembling voice. Whatever the cause, it seemed all too likely that Maplewood was about to become the stage for a drama of secrets, suspicions, and possibly something more troubling. And Miss Marple, with her quiet yet penetrating insight, intended to be right there in the front row, studying the cast as each played their part. Chapter 2. Shadows at Dovecote Cottage. By the delicate glow of early morning light, St. Mary was woken with a quiet rustle of movement. Miss Jane Marple, seated by her parlour window, viewed the tidy lawns and hedge with the discerning eye of someone who knew every inch of the village, its gossip, secrets, and quiet joys. She sipped her tea thoughtfully, musing on the curious happenings at Dovecote Cottage. The previous evening, where a suppressed cry had been heard ringing through the stillness. No one was certain where it came from or who had spoken it, but in St. Mary Me, such mysteries never remained unanswered for long, decided to uncover whether anything genuinely sinister had transpired. Miss Marple walked out into the alley and soon saw Mrs. Dolly Bantry, a dear friend and known enthusiast of anything remotely scandalous. Mrs. Rose's eyes shone with excitement, and she cried, "My dear Jane, people are saying that poor Miss Vinia Brent was seen running from her own house in a dreadful state. She claimed she was startled by a prowler. You can imagine how this talk is setting tongues wagging." "I see," murmured Miss Marple, her placid tone belling the quick calculations of her mind. Miss Lavinia was by nature a timid soul, always flinching at sudden noises, yet she was no fantasist. Something genuine must have frightened her. "Yes," Miss Marple continued softly, "I must have a little chat with her, if only to soothe. Good morning, Miss Marle." Mrs. Rose said, pretending casualness. "You'll never guess. Dr. Haddock was summoned to Dovecote Cottage at morning." Miss Clara was in such a state that she nearly fainted twice after exchanging a few compassionate remarks. Miss Marple pressed on alone, threading her way through the rose-bordered gardens until she reached the low stone wall around Dovecote Cottage. She was impressed by how commonplace everything appeared. Immaculate flower gardens, a polished knocker, and delicate draperies drawn neatly aside. Only the drawn expression on Miss Clara's face, glimpsed at the window, indicated at the unrest within. When Miss Marple entered, she discovered Miss Clara sitting on the edge of an armchair, clutching a handkerchief as though it were a lifeline. The poor woman's voice quivered. "Oh, Miss Marle," she murmured, "I was positive I heard footsteps in the garden last night. Then I heard that dreadful shriek. I hurried to the window, and I could have sworn I saw a person sliding into the shadows." Miss Marple lay a reassuring hand on hers. There, my dear," she soothed. "Dr. Dew has seen to you. I trust rest is the greatest medicine for shock." But even as she spoke, Miss Marple's gaze scanned the cottage interior. Her eyes lingered on a tea tray with 2 cups, each carrying faint lipstick stains. Miss Clara lived alone. Had she hosted a visitor prior to this awful occurrence? Their chat was interrupted by a light knock, and in walked Inspector Slack. Looking rather stiff and officious, he inquired hurriedly about any signs of forced entry. Miss Clara shook her head. "Nothing is missing, Inspector, only my peace of mind," she added, her voice trembling. Miss Marple noticed a weird flicker of relief run across Miss Clara's features, at odds with her apparent worry. There was more to this issue. Miss Marple felt certain than a mere scare in the dark. Perhaps a visitor had upset Miss Clara. Perhaps something was spoken that was disturbing enough to linger in her mind and echo as that midnight cry bidding, "Miss Clara, farewell." Miss Marple stepped back out into the tidy lane behind the calm facade of St. Mary Mead. She was sure a secret stirred, ready to reveal itself under her gentle but penetrating scrutiny. And as she walked home, the spectre of those unseen footsteps followed, a silent reminder that danger often lurked even amid the village's most tranquil gardens. Chapter 3. Quiet Suspicions. The morning sun flowed softly through the lace drapes of Miss Marple's quaint drawing room, illuminating the lovely designs along the background. She grinned as she rose from her chair, recalling the events at Dovecote Cottage, but no new alarm had disturbed Miss Marple. Sensed something seething beneath St. Mary Me's placid surface, so she decided to take a short walk to the High Street, past the church, where she spotted the Reverend Leonard Clement adjusting the flower arrangements by the gate. He greeted her with a friendly smile. Good morning, Miss Marple. Are you off to see Miss Clara? I understand she's still very concerned. Miss Marple answered. A thoughtful crease appeared between her brows. These unsettled nerves don't suit her. I believe a friendly visit may help her feel more secure, yet before Miss Marple could continue, the Vicar lowered his voice. Inspector Slack dropped by earlier, he confided. Hunes quietly making inquiries about who might have visited Miss Clara on the night of that dreadful shriek. Miss Marple nodded, thanked him for the information, and went along the cobblestone path, pausing at Mrs. Price Ridley's well-maintained rose bushes. The fearsome woman herself emerged at the gate, wearing a big brimmed hat and expressing mild disdain. Miss Clara is too delicate, if you ask me, she declared without preamble. Such fuss about a mere noise in the night, and now the inspector poking around as if there's been a murder. She gave an exaggerated sigh, though Miss Marple noted the quick flicker of curiosity in her eyes. Even minor disturbances can cause real distress. Mrs. Price Ridley, Miss Morrel, observed nicely, especially for those predisposed to nerves, and went on her walk, pondering on how St. Mary's greatest joy and curse was its endless stream of conjecture. Finally, Miss Marple arrived at Dovecote Cottage. Miss Lavinia Brent greeted her at the threshold, hands trembling despite her fiercest smile. A vibrant patchwork bedspread and a profusion of tiny teacups gave pleasure to the little area, but Miss Clara's worried eyes glanced toward the window more than once after exchanging pleasantries. Miss Marple softly guided the discussion. I understand Dr. Heoke stopped by yesterday, she began, accepting a cup of chamomile tea. I hope you're feeling better. Miss Clara held her teacup closely. Yes, he was kind, but I'm afraid my nerves aren't what they used to be. I was so certain I saw a figure in the garden that night. I can't get the image out of my head quietly. Miss Marple suggested you had a guest earlier that evening, and I suppose her eyes flicked ever so briefly to the side table, where a single white glove lay neglected. Miss Clara lowered her gaze. Yeah, I had a friend calling. He departed at nightfall. We only discussed some parish affairs. She hesitated. I honestly think there is nothing more to it. Miss Marple could have accepted that, if she hadn't detected the faint flush. Instead of crossing Miss Clara's cheeks when she spoke, she simply smiled and changed the subject, all the while storing that small detail for later consideration. Outside, the autumn air was bright, the leaves rustling with a crisp promise of change. As Miss Marple made her way home, she found Inspector Slack waiting outside her gate. Notebook in hand, he greeted her with a businesslike nod. We've had a complaint of footprints in the way behind Dovecote Cottage, he said, frowning. They appear like a man's boots because of the size. Miss Marple eyed him with quiet attention. Most curious. I wonder if Miss Clara's acquaintance might have lingered longer than she realizes. She paused, eyes narrowing thoughtfully. Of course, there are always others going through. One never knows quite what secrets people bear. The inspector sniffed. She's a timid thing, but nerves alone don't explain everything. He tipped his hat and strode away, leaving Miss Marple to her thoughts resting by the garden gate. Miss Marple looked across the village rooftops. How frequently she had watched that seemingly regular individuals occasionally execute the most amazing things born of fear, desperation, or the urge to keep up appearances. Dovetail Cottage hid a secret, she felt convinced, and with the quiet diligence that had so often served her well, she intended to find it before any harm occurred. Miss Clara or anyone else beneath St. Mary's serene facade. Chapter 4. An unexpected visitor. St. Mary Me awoke the following day to a silvery drizzle, the sort that made the cobblestones glisten and lent the hedgerows afresh. Why Sheen? Despite the weather, Miss Marple rose early, intent on continuing her quiet investigation into the recent disturbances at Dovecote Cottage. Dressed in her sensible tweed skirt and cardigan, she set out with her trusty umbrella, her head overflowing with possibilities. Her first stop was the village post office, run by the ever-watchful Miss Pollett, who seemed delighted to catch a glimpse of Miss Marple. Busy morning. Miss Pollett chirped, passing a handful of letters across the counter. They say, "Poor Miss Clara hardly slept a wink last night. I wonder what or who could be haunting her." So Miss Marple inclined her head, adopting a sympathetic expression. "Oh, I do hope she's feeling better." One can hardly blame her for being nervous with so many odd. Miss Marple walked next to the greengrocer's, where she met Colonel Bantry, engaged in conversation with Dr. Hawke. The Colonel tipped his head graciously. "Morning, Miss Marple. You've heard the latest, I take it. Inspector Slack paid Miss Clara a visit at dawn. Seems he wanted to follow up on some footprints spotted near her back gate." "Oh dear." Miss Marple mumbled, her eyes darting to Dr. Hawke, whose normally placid features were drawn in a concerned frown. "Footprints again, but do they hint to something decisive?" The Colonel was only shrugged, though Dr. Hawke cleared his throat. "Apparently not," he said quietly, "yet Slack is confident there's more to the story." Miss Clara remains evasive, which only heightens his concerns. Miss Marple returned with a gentle smile. "Sometimes people withhold details out of fear or embarrassment, Doctor, but this does not necessarily mean they're guilty of wrongdoing." Dr. Hawke nodded, but his look suggested that he, too, suspected Miss Clara of keeping a secret that could be vital to comprehending this strange line of events. Leaving the shop, Miss Marple decided to visit Miss Clara directly. The drizzle had subsided by then, and the aroma of damp earth drifted through the cottage garden. When she arrived at Dovecote Cottage, she found the door answered not by Miss Clara, but by an unexpected visitor, a tall, dark-haired man with a stern countenance and the faintest hint of a London accent in his voice. "Oh, I'm sorry," he stammered, his gaze briefly flicking to Miss Mark's inquisitive eyes. "I was just leaving." Miss Marple responded politely, standing aside so he could pass. As he slipped past, she noted the cuff of his overcoat was slightly soiled, as if he had been tramping over wet grass. A hasty nod, and disappeared down the garden path. When Miss Marple stepped inside, she discovered Miss Clara seated in the parlour. Her cheeks flushed, and she appeared disturbed. Miss Marple exclaimed, attempting a grin, "How very sweet of you to drop by. I was just conversing with a well-known acquaintance." A subtle tilt of Miss Marple's head revealed her curiosity. "I must confess, I'm not familiar with him, my darling. A friend from outside the community." A little tremor raced through Miss Clara's hands as she clenched them in her lap. "Something like that," she muttered. Her tone suggested she was not eager to expound, detecting Miss Clara's anxiety. Miss Marple took the seat nearest the window, providing her with a discreet view of the garden. The precipitation had returned, spreading tiny puddles across the grass as she and Miss Clara exchanged idle banter about the weather and the new rose kinds. Miss Marple's keen attention spotted minor details, such as a half-packed valise in the corner and a fresh tear stain on Miss Clara's embroidered tablecloth, each clue hinting at underlying anxiety. Miss Clara apologized for her distracted air, explaining that she had errands to run in the village. Miss Marple politely said her goodbyes, promising to call again soon. Stepping back out into the damp lane, she found her mind brimming with questions. Who was the mysterious stranger, and why had he visited so early in the day? Could he be the man Miss Brent had seen prowling outside, or had he come to offer her some form of assistance with each new puzzle? Miss Marple's conviction deepened. that something more than idle fancy haunted Dovecote Cottage. Standing beneath her umbrella, she gazed at the shuttered windows, reflecting that secrets rarely remained hidden for long in St. Mary's, especially once Miss Jane Marple set her gentle but penetrating mind to solving them. Chapter 5. Rumours and Revelations. The following morning, a light haze lay over St. Mary's, giving the settlement an almost ethereal hue. Every leaf glistened with dew, and a faint mist clung to the cathedral spire. Miss Marple, always an early riser, took her customary stroll after breakfast, greeting neighbours as she went, though the dawn chorus of birds sounded as sweet as ever. There was an undercurrent of tension in the air, an expectation that something was about to happen. Her first call was at the vicarage, where the Reverend Leonard Clement met her in the drive boots, muddied from tending his flower beds. "Ah, Miss Marple," he began, his voice tinged with excitement. "Have you heard our latest visitor? The strange fellow saw at Dovecote Cottage was sighted at the King's Arms last night." The King's Arms was the only public house in St. Mary Me, and guests there rarely went unnoticed. Miss Marple thanked him for the information, marvelling at how quickly gossip spread, and made her way to the church gardens, as she had planned to deliver a small posy for the altar. While adjusting the flowers in a vase, she noticed the Reverend's wife Griselda engaged in urgent whispers with Mrs. Rose. Their faces bore expressions of concern and intrigue. Miss Marple couldn't help but wonder if they were talking the same stranger, so she crossed the way to see how Miss Lavinia Brent fared. Dovecote Cottage was curiously sad, with shutters still drawn at an hour when other locals were already busy with their responsibilities. Miss Marple knocked lightly and was shocked to find the door opened by the same guy she had seen the previous day. This time he appeared calmer, though a slight cloud of worry still seemed to hover about him. "Oh," he said, quickly recognizing her. "Miss Clara had stepped out for a bit and asked me to remain here in her absence." His tone was scrupulously courteous, but his stance radiated uneasiness. Miss Marple's eyes swept the small entryway with practiced thoroughness, noticing a broken vase, carefully wrapped in newspaper, by the hall table. "I hope everything is well." Mr. She let the question hang as an invitation for him to supply his name. He hesitated just a fraction of a second. "Squires," he replied, offering a tight-lipped smile. "Raymond Squires, I'm an old acquaintance." There was a tinge of nervousness in his voice that Miss Marple noticed. "I see," she murmured gently. "I do hope Miss Clara is feeling better. Dovecote Cottage has been a place of worry these last days." Before he could respond, she continued, "If you'll be so kind as to inform her that I called, I'd be most grateful." Miss Marple stepped back into the fearing that Raymond Squires might not be fully truthful about his relationship with Miss Clara. Had they quarrelled? Or was Miss Clara battling with a financial difficulty that demanded a covert arrangement? Determined to find out more, Miss Marple went the route behind Dovecote Cottage, where she had heard footprints had been found, which meandered around a hedge and opened onto a tiny clearing here. Miss Marple crouched carefully, noting the soft earth. She discovered faint impressions in the ground, large footprints pressed deep, suggesting a heavier man than Mr. Squires, and some smaller ones, no doubt. Miss Clara's, yet there was another set too lighter than the first, but unmistakably not made by a dainty shoe could they belong to a second visitor. Her musings were interrupted by the sound of a snapping twig. Looking up, she saw Inspector Slack standing a few yards away. "His Miss Marple," he continued quickly. "I may have known I'd find you here. You've got a nose for mischief, no mistake." Smiling pleasantly, Miss Marple rose, simply observing the inspection, sometimes notices more in the calm of a country lane than in a noisy parlor. Slack eyed her suspiciously. Let me remind you, this is official business. There have been concerns about Miss Clara's welfare and that chap Squires. Something about him doesn't quite add up. Indeed, Miss Marple responded calmly. Do keep me informed. If you learn anything new, Inspector, I'm sure we both have Miss Clara's best interests at heart. With a curt nod, Slack walked away. Miss Marple, alone with her thoughts, headed back toward the village, the pleasant calm of the clearing giving way to the distant hum of midday life. As she stepped carefully over the footprints, Miss Marple's mind filled with speculations about who else had been hiding behind the cottage. What were Miss Clara's secrets, and how did Raymond Squires fit into the jigsaw under the warm sunshine of St. Mary Mead? The shadow of suspicion grew ever longer, but Miss Marple, with her quiet persistence, felt surer than ever that the truth would soon emerge. Chapter 6. A shimmer of doubt. Light. Rain drummed quietly on the windows of Miss Marple's neat little parlor the next morning, lending the room a cozy warmth undeterred by the dampness. She donned her waterproof cape and set out toward the high street, her mind fixed on the various pieces of the puzzle surrounding Miss Lavinia Brent. Mrs. Rose began in hushed excitement. I've just come from tea with Grisel Clement. She mentioned something rather peculiar. Apparently Miss Clara has been spotted taking solitary walks quite late in the evening through that overgrown footpath near the abandoned mill. It seems most unusual for a timid woman like her. Miss Marple raised her eyebrows in mild surprise. How curious, she responded, tucking the information away. I can't imagine Miss Clara choosing such a lonely route until Miss Pollitt, ever the gossip, greeted her with eager chatter. We've had a telegram this morning addressed to Miss Brent, she whispered confidentially. The sender's name was smudged, but it looked like it began with S. Might it be from that Mr. Squire's odd business? I say, Miss Marple accepted her own post and thanked Miss Pollitt, reflecting on how a telegram might signify urgency if it were indeed from Mr. Squires. Perhaps it held a clue to the nature of his relationship with Miss Clara. Miss Marple risked the relentless drizzle to call on Miss Clara. The windows of Dovecote Cottage gleamed with lamplight, but the curtains were pulled securely. Miss Marple rapped gently on the door, and after a time it opened to reveal Miss Clara pale, with a tiny tremor in her voice betraying her inner distress. Miss Marple, she forced a smile. How nice of you to come. I've been feeling a little under the weather sitting in the parlor. Miss Marple noticed that the shattered vase was still nowhere to be found, and the half-packed Val she had seen earlier had vanished from sight. A faint, musty scent clung to the air, as if Miss Clara had disregarded her usual housekeeping routine. My dear, Miss Marple spoke softly. I couldn't help but notice you seemed distressed the last time I visited. Are you certain there's no trouble weighing on your mind? Miss Clara hesitated, her gaze flickering anxiously to the window. I'm sure it's nothing, she murmured, pressing her hands together. Everyone seems so concerned about me, but I'm afraid I don't have much to offer in the way of an explanation. Before Miss Marple could press any further, there came a sudden knock at the door, startling Miss Clara. This time, Inspector Slack stood on the threshold, rain dripping from his hat, and announced that he was following up on reports of unusual comings and goings at the cottage. Miss Clara stiffened as Miss Marple discreetly observed every shift in her expression. I've heard that someone was seen lurking around here after dark. I'd like to know, Miss Clara. Miss Clara swallowed hard. No one, she stammered, but a subtle tension in her posture suggested otherwise. She clutched the doorknob so tightly that her knuckles whitened with a small, polite cough. Miss Marple excused herself, thinking that Inspector Slack's interrogation may be more direct if she were absent. As she stepped out into the rain-soaked garden, she looked back at the parlour window. A thin half-moon hung low over St. Mary Me that evening, spreading long, meandering shadows across the roads. The village, so tranquil by day, seemed cloaked in an air of expectancy, as if every window concealed a watcher and every corner held an echo of some whispered confidence. Miss Marple, ever attuned to such undercurrents, found herself unable to rest. She wrapped a warm shawl round her shoulders and settled in her fireside chair, thoughts drifting inevitably to Miss Lavinia. Brent earlier that day, Miss Marple spotted the terrified young woman rushing down the edge of the churchyard, her look pallid and strained. Miss Clara held her handbag tightly as if frightened of losing something essential. Was it just her nerves, or was she actually guarding a secret? Miss Marple remembered how Inspector Slack had pressed her for answers, and how the mysterious Mr. Raymond Squires had arrived and departed under such tense circumstances. Each time she played the puzzle over in her mind, new questions appeared, desiring fresh insights. Miss Marple stepped onto her porch and paused, listening to the subdued hush of the village. Night in the distance, a dog barked once, and then fell silent down the lane. A single light burned in the vicarage window, perhaps. The Reverend and Grisella Clement lingered over late-night reading, but Miss Marple's focus lay elsewhere. Dovecote Cottage, nestled in darkness, with only the barest sliver of lamplight escaping through a gap in the curtains, summoning a quiet resolve, she strolled along the deserted road. The moonlight revealed footprints on the damp ground her own footsteps from earlier visits, crisscrossed by others. As she approached the cottage, she noticed the garden gate ajar inside. Faint rustles suggested that someone moved about in the overgrown shrubbery. A cat might have made such mismarks. Gentle heart fluttered, but she pressed on, curiosity tempered by calm determination. She was about to knock when the front door abruptly opened. There stood Raymond Squires, his face tow with disquiet. He appeared taken aback by Miss Marple's unexpected presence, but quickly recovered. "Good evening," he managed, voice subdued. I was just leaving. Is Miss Clara quite well?" Miss Marple asked, peering past him into the narrow hallway. She glimpsed scattered papers on the small. Miss Marple inclined her head, stepping back so he might slip past. There was mud splattered high on the cuffs of his trousers, suggesting he had walked off the path, very possibly in hurry. "Do offer her my compliments," she added softly, watching as he practically raced down the lane alone. Miss Marple chose not to intrude on Miss Clara at such a late hour. Instead, she took a careful turn around the garden, discovering that a low side window stood open just wide enough for someone to enter or leave discreetly. Under the moons of illumination, she caught sight of footprints in the soft earth below the sill. They appeared fresh, imprinting the ground with a distinct tread. Her eyes narrowed, thoughts spinning with the implications of a secret entrance or exit the following. Miss Marple sat in her parlour, resolved to seek guidance from a reliable friend, Mrs. Dolly Bantry, always keen to talk anything exciting, arrived quickly for tea over the quiet clink of cups and spoons. Miss Marple narrated her nightly observations. Mrs. Rose's eyes widened with concern mingling with excitement. "It's most peculiar," she whispered, and Miss Clara, if only she would confide in someone sipping her tea. Miss Marple explained her suspicion that Miss Clara's predicament involved more than fear of a nocturnal prowler. "Human nature," she said gently, "often leads the most unassuming people to desperate acts when threatened or beholden to another. I'm convinced Miss Clara struggles was something that has ensnared her, and that Mrs. Rose leaned forward anxiously, but Miss Marple only shook her head. "I'd rather not speculate loudly," she mumbled. "Not until I'm confident within," but her mind snapped with calm. Ensure the footprints near the window, the late-night visits, and the telegram from an unknown sender all formed a pattern soon. Miss Marple believed events would force the truth to emerge, and as she bid Mrs. Rose farewell, she felt a distinct sense that the final unraveling was close at hand, like the tightening of a thread that would snap in a sudden, startling clarity. Chapter 8. Truth at Dovecote Cottage. St. Mary. I awakened to a bright, clear morning and a palpable air of expectation regarding the mystery surrounding Miss Lavinia. Brent had captured the imaginations of the villagers, and whispers drifted from garden fences to grocery queues. Miss Marple, as always, welcomed her neighbors graciously, while her mind worked over every clue, the imprints, the late-night visits, and Miss Clara's palpable fear. Shortly after breakfast, Inspector Slack arrived at Miss Marple's cottage, doing his hat with an air of weary frustration. "I've tried talking to Miss Brent again," he said grimly, "but she refuses to speak plainly, and that fellow Squires, well, he's gone missing, at least for the moment. One of my constables saw him board the London bus last night." Miss Marple tilted her head thoughtfully indeed, and might one ask if he? Miss Marple's eyes glinted, implying that he intended to return, or that he departed in such a hurry that he couldn't gather everything. Either scenario is telling. Encouraged by her calm insight, Inspector Slack requested Miss Marple to join him at Dovecote Cottage. The couple discovered Miss Clara pale, but resolved, seated by the parlour hearth. The cottage felt strangely muted. The drapes were partially drawn despite the sunshine outside. Miss Clara gripped a small letter in her lap, her knuckles whitening around its edges. "I think you both ought to know," she began in a shaky voice, and met Miss Marple's sympathetic look. "Mr. Squire and I knew each other years ago when I was younger, and he helped me out of a difficult situation at a cost." Miss Marple nodded encouragingly, and Miss Clara's voice faltered as he reappeared suddenly, demanding that I repay him. When I hesitated, he threatened, and she drew a shaking breath. I allowed him to stay here, but the stress became unbearable. I thought I heard prowlers at night, but it was often just him returning late from who knows where. Miss Clara smiled, a sorrowful look. "You don't understand, I owed him. But worse, I feared scandal. He claimed to possess letters that could destroy my reputation if released. I wanted to keep my past secret, so as the tales circulated about footsteps and screaming, I worried and pretended ignorance, expecting everything would pass. At that moment there was a soft tap at the door, and in stepped Raymond Squires himself, looking apologetic and worn. "I overheard your talk, Lavinia," he murmured gently. "The guilt has been gnawing at me. I acted cry holding those letters over. The truth is, I lost my job in London. I needed money desperately, but I'm ashamed of what I've done." Inspector Slack moved towards him, but Miss Marple raised a hand. With quiet authority, "You left in a hurry last night, Mr. Squires. Why return now?" He ran a hand through his hair. "Because I realized I couldn't go through with it. I destroyed the letters. See." He produced a scorched envelope from his coat pocket. The edges singed. I've know for a moment silence settled over the parlour, then Miss Brent tears. Welling whispered, I believe you. Oh, how foolish. I've been letting shame rule me." Inspector Slack, though still wary, sensed the drama had run its course. There would be consequences, most likely, of some legal matters to address, but the threat to Miss Brent's peace of mind was over. Outside, Miss Marple stepped into the brightness of day. Pausing under the rose arch, Inspector Slack offered a gruff nod of appreciation. "You had it figured out all along, didn't you?" Not entirely, she demurred, but human nature so often repeats itself. Fear, desperation, and secrecy can lead people to do most unfortunate things. Her voice became meek and poor. Miss Clara was trapped by her own sense of shame, and Mr. Squires by his desperation. Once one understands that the rest follows with the mystery at Dovecote Cottage, resolved St. Mary. May's tranquil air returned, though for Miss Marple it was simply another reminder that beneath the veneer of village life passions and regrets still brewed, and as she made her way home, she silently thanked her years of quiet observation for guiding her to the truth once more.